We have this sort of in-group, out-group bias that might be sort of hardwired in us because of our evolutionary psychology, because of the populations and the way hominids or humans emerged evolutionarily in small groups. A great example is this sort of in-group, out-group bias that humans emerged in small groups that were very cooperative and that you shared and divided labor amongst that group so that group could do very well. But then you competed against or didn't share with the out-group, right? And so that might be hardwired into our psychology, right? That's something that certainly influences the way we interact with people in the world today. But it's interesting that we have the ability to recognize maybe we have this bias. And so that gives us the ability to do something about it. Over the last maybe 200 years, a society has become much more multicultural, right? You start to interact more with people outside your ethnic group, outside your religious group. And there's been, sort of an increased sort of intolerance of the other in a sense, particularly the latter half of maybe the 20th century, as people recognize that in any city in the United States that you live in, you have to interact with multicultural groups and people that aren't like you. And I think that helps us, overcome those biases that we recognize, but now we're sort of forced to in polite society to overcome them. I think the problem is in the last, say 20 years, we've reverted because now instead of having to interact with people that live around you or in your neighborhood, you can stay inside your house and interact with people on social media that only agree with what you agree. So we sort of revert back to this sort of tribalism where we just talk to people that agree with us or look like us or believe things that we believe or the same politics or the same religion. And we're sort of reverting back to this tribalism, this in-group, out-group, and you have this more sort of this infighting going on because we have a way of interacting with people that agree with us and not having to interact with people that disagree with us. And I think, that's concerning, but I think a lot of people recognize that. And that's the thing, like we have these biases, but they don't determine how we act because we can recognize we have these biases. We have the ability to say, okay, I'm going to let those biases shape how I interact with people, or am I going to let those biases recognize those and then deliberately make choices so that I can overcome those biases. I think my curiosity really got sparked in college when you show up on campus and I realized I can take all of these different classes, right? And there were so many different disciplines to take. It took me 2 years to figure out what I wanted to study, what I wanted to major in, because I was taking physics classes, history classes, English classes. And I eventually settled on English literature. And I think I was drawn to that because, great literature always is asking these meta questions. What does it mean to be human? What's the purpose of our lives? Why do people struggle in their lives so much, right? You see, what is the point of suffering? And all of these things that are there, these questions that we all ask ourselves are asked in very beautiful and poetic ways in great literature. And it really makes you think about, why am I living the way I am and so forth. But at the same time, I was also taking science classes. And so it really was my senior year. I was invited to work in a lab as an undergraduate. And I really fell in love with that. I was working on a virus, trying to understand how it worked. And you can see, well, if I can understand the proteins that make it up, I can figure it out. And sort of the power of science to be able to understand how things work or how things were put together. That was really sort of powerful and intoxicating in a sense to me. But at the same time, I really, had this desire to understand and investigate these bigger questions. And so what really sort of propelled me as I went through my science career was to think about what is science still and how can that be used, or how does it relate to these bigger questions, or can it even be used to ask these bigger questions? How does it relate to sort of philosophy and literature and so forth? And that sort of animated, I think the way I've thought throughout my professional life. It seems like in modern society, science has taken on a role that puts it above every other discipline, and sort of the ultimate arbiter of truth, that we can look to science to give us answers. If you look back over the millennia of the story of science, all the way from Galileo up to the modern times, science is influenced by the culture it's done in, by the politics of that culture, by the religion of that culture, right? And by the egos and biases of the scientists themselves. So science is never done in a vacuum, and that's something I think a lot of people don't fully appreciate, because they think science will have some unbiased answer. Now, I'm not saying, at the end of the day, the science, because it's got a sort of self-correcting method, it can overcome those biases in due time. But it is, at any given time, sort of influenced by different competing theories. I was really struck in grad school about, some of the professors there were involved in very acrimonious disputes over whose theory was correct about some scientific piece of knowledge. And you realize, okay, this is not fully a detached, sort of objective investigation of knowledge, that there are egos and biases that come into play, particularly in the present moment. Eventually, those tend to get sorted out over time, but in the moment, there's a lot of things that influence what science says and how we can learn from it. So a good example of the limits of science and how science needs to interact with other ways of knowing is the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. And the first thing to recognize there is that, that we're trying to learn about this. It's like learning to fly as the plane is going down, right? In the sense that, we're learning as the pandemic goes on. We learn about, okay, how long do you have resistance to the virus if you've had it before? How long do the vaccines might work? There's all of these things we're learning as we go. So we never have complete knowledge. Science is always giving us new knowledge, and we have to use that to modify our previous knowledge and so forth. So when we say, follow the science, what we're really doing is trying to follow the best science that we currently have, which could be partly true and could be partly incorrect, because as we get new knowledge, we start to realize what we didn't know before. The other thing to recognize, though, is that science doesn't dictate how we need to respond to things. So science can tell you, okay, this is the virus, this is what it looks like, this is how it's transmitted, this is what people might have. But how we respond to that as society depends on a lot of other factors. There's economic issues that come into play. There's psychological issues that come into play if everybody has to be sheltered in their houses, for example. So the simplest thing, we can just say, there's a virus, everybody stay inside their house for 10 years. We know nobody's going to get sick, right? Scientifically, that would work, but we know we can't do that because of all the consequences of that. And all those things have to be weighed by that society as you move forward. One of the things that we're often stuck dealing with is our appetite, for food, right? And so, humans, their psychology, their appetites is sort of evolved in an environment where food wasn't available on a regular basis for us, right? And so we crave things that are fatty, because that would be, if we found a fatty meal, that's going to help sustain us for the next 2 days where we don't get a meal, for example. And so that can be used against us, because now we get plenty of food, particularly in the Western world, but our appetites and so forth are sort of hardwired for a creature that's not getting necessarily regular meals, or meals that are as nutrient rich. And so we crave those fatty foods and those extra calories, those sugary foods that we don't necessarily need. And that's one of those evolutionary pressures that we have to learn to overcome. In terms of our evolutionary sort of sexual appetites, right? There's people that argue that humans are hardwired for polygamy, because a lot of the other primates are polygamous. But a couple things about that. One is that there's a lot of primates, probably about 10% roughly, that are monogamous. And so there's no cue we can take from primates in general that would dictate how humans are meant to live out their sexual lives, right? So you can say, chimps and bonobos are our closest living ancestors. We split off from them about 6 to 7 million years ago, the lineage leading to them. Chimps and bonobos are polygamous, but they're polygamous in sort of different ways. Bonobos are very sexually active, much more so than chimps. But it's pretty clear, I think, in the evolutionary lineage leading up to humans, that there are things that would have favored more monogamous relationships, or an increase in monogamy, particularly in these small social groups where you needed more sharing of resources to help raise children that are more helpless, when they're born. So there's a variety of different sort of evolutionary theories and evolutionary evidence that suggests that there might be some benefit to monogamy in modern humans and in other hominids in the last 2 million years. So should we take our cue from chimps and that's how we should behave? Should we take our cue from bonobos? Well, if we do that, should we take our cue from them on other behaviors? The fact that they will fight other groups and kill, like chimps from other neighboring group. Is that something, that's hardwired in us, that's what we should do? Or do we have the ability to recognize certain biases or certain things and recognize, there's more to us than just our evolutionary drives?